Oh, this is so much work. I got a history test tomorrow and there's no way I'll learn all this in time. This is impossible.
Behold, I am the spirit of your America's History 8th edition textbook. I know all about American history.
Wow! Can you help me with chapters 5, 6, and 7?
Yes, I can. Yeah, I could do that.
Alrighty! Let's go!
Well, there was no more important time in America's history than its very founding. And after the Great War for Empire, Britain needed to raise money to pay off its new war debts. What better way to do this than to tax the Americans, whom they saw as entitled and foreign? This set off a tirade of tyrannical taxes that would lead to America's founding.
Wait, but America was part of Britain. Couldn't they just argue in Parliament that the taxes were unfair?
Americans actually had no say in Parliament. The British argued that this was fair because Americans had virtual representation, since some of the British members of Parliament had companies operating in America. Now, thanks to state-of-the-art technology, we can simulate what virtual representation was really like. Roll the tape. George Grenville was the man who ended salutary neglect of the colonies. He quickly became the colony's first British enemy. Grenville first passed the Sugar Act of 1764 to replace the often ignored Molasses Act of 1733. The Sugar Act lowered the tax on French molasses so that it was payable, while also tightening customs enforcement to make sure it was collected. This angered New England merchants, who had made their fortunes smuggling French molasses. Next, Grenville passed the Currency Act of 1764, which banned the colonies from using paper currency. Finally, Grenville imposed the Stamp Act of 1765, which truly sparked the first great imperial crisis. The act required a tax stamp on all printed items, be it college diplomas, newspapers, almanacs, playing cards, origami cranes, death threats, whatever. This really upset the colonists. 9 assemblies gathered at the Stamp Act Congress to protest, and a group called the Sons of Liberty burned an effigy of a tax collector and destroyed his warehouse. Tensions were high.
Wow!
And there was also the Quartering Act of 1765, which peeved people even more by forcing colonists to house very rude British soldiers in their homes. But even more acts just kept coming. Charles Townshend instituted the Townshend Act of 1767, which put taxes on colonial imports of paper, paint, glass, and tea, basically the goods everyone used. This infuriated colonists, and colonial women, aka the Daughters of Liberty, began a non-importation movement, where they handmade everything and didn't buy British goods. After that came the Boston Massacre, where 9 redcoats killed 5 Bostonians.
That doesn't seem like a massacre at all. Just 5 people?
Well, it was drummed up as something much bigger than it really was. And then there was even the Boston Tea Party, where Bostonians protesting the new Tea Act dumped English tea into the ocean. The point is, there was some massive tension there, and war was almost inevitable. When the Second Continental Congress met in 1775, the reconciliation letter to the king was rejected, and the Loyalists had abandoned the group. George Washington was elected to head the Continental Army, and independence was declared.
So that's it? They got their independence right then?
No, but this declaration leads into a long war for independence, also known as... And just to make this section a little more interesting, and a little more fast-paced, I'll be going over this section in song. Cue music! Okay, so the background track of this is actually a remix of The Girl I Left Behind Me, which is a song from the Civil War, but, you know, close enough. After the British, when Lexington conquered and Long Island, across the Delaware, Washington came, made them go silent. The U.S. won a major victory at Saratoga. 5K troops captured and France joined in, guaranteeing more. Allying with the French was a very bold move for both sides. France is a Catholic monarchy while the US wants to be a Protestant democracy. By all means, they should not have gotten along well, but they were united over their mutual hatred of the English, a union which would hurt France in the end. So good old George led his troops to Valley Forge, where they would get trained by Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Treuben, who was some Prussian guy. Slaves were encouraged to run away and to join the British by the Philipsburg Proclamation, which freed them when they're finished. Cornwallis was surrounded and surrendered at Yorktown, which caused the Treaty of Paris to be signed by the Crown. US got land in recognition, debts must be collected. France lost money and had won much less than was expected. Thank you. I'll be here all night, because I'm a book.
That was a pretty fast chapter.
That's just the war part. After the war, the new nation instituted the Articles of Confederation, in which each state retains independence and sovereignty, each state has one vote, and states essentially have power over a weak federal government. The federal government is so weak, in fact, that it can't even institute a national tax system to fix the country's new financial crisis. They could, however, have enough power to create the Northwest Ordinance, which organized the territories that would become Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. But the financial crisis led to Shays' Rebellion, where people revolted against the government's inability to handle its finances. The rebellion also took way too long to put down, weakening people's faith in the country's leadership even more. Finally, in May 1787, the Constitution was created with the understanding a Bill of Rights would be added later.
So that's it?
There's a little bit more left. The states were split over how population and state votes should be counted. The Virginia plan said that votes should be based on population, since Virginia had a large population. And the New Jersey plan proposed that each state get an equal vote, since New Jersey has a small population. The Great Compromise instituted both and set up our modern 3 branches of government that we still have today.
Go, 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 go! Listen now. Here we go!
After the states ratified the Constitution, it was time for the first election. The Federalists dominated the election of 1788, winning 44 out of 52 seats in the House. George Washington won every electoral vote to become the first president, and John Adams came in second and became his vice president. Washington appointed Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury.
What kinds of fascinating programs did Alexander Hamilton implement as Secretary of the Treasury?
Hamilton's first action as Secretary of the Treasury was to ask Congress for the federal government to assume the war debts of the states and to redeem securities to foreign investors. Hamilton created the National Bank, which was jointly owned by the federal government and private stockholders. The bank was intended to provide stability by making loans to merchants, handling government expenditures, and issuing bills of credit. Hamilton's third proposal was to raise revenue through tariffs, but he did not support high protective tariffs. These financial policies were a major success, and revenue from the tariffs soon paid down the national debt.
What did Jefferson think of Hamilton's schemes?
Jefferson envisioned the U.S. as expanding westward and creating a society of independent human farmers who provided food for Europe. The French Revolution helped Jefferson, as wheat rose in price and farmers grew prosperous from exports. But this was not the same vision that Hamilton shared.
The French Revolution was a pretty big deal. Did the U.S. poke its head in it all?
President Washington actually issued a proclamation of neutrality, allowing the U.S. to trade with all combatants. This policy led to contention when the British began impounding U.S. ships, and in response, Washington dispatched John Jay to negotiate with the British. He agreed to a controversial treaty in which the U.S. government was required to fully compensate British merchants for pre-Revolutionary War debts, in return for the British allowing Americans to submit claims for illegal seizures and promising to leave the forts in the Northwest Territory of the U.S. that they had yet to abandon.
So who was president after Washington?
John Adams was the second president. He issued the Naturalization, Alien, and Sedition Acts, which made it harder for immigrants to become citizens, allowed the president to deport immigrants, and prevented people from criticizing the government, respectively. During his presidency, Congress cut all trade with France over an incident known as the XYZ affair, in which U.S. diplomats refused a bribe from French officials. Adams's policies damaged the Federalist Party and led to a Jefferson victory in the election of 1800.
What policies did Jefferson pursue as president?
Jefferson supported westward expansion of the United States, as I said earlier. In the Louisiana Purchase, he used a loose interpretation of the Constitution to purchase the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon, doubling the size of the U.S. Americans moved west in droves and forced out the Indians already living there. Jefferson also reversed many Federalist policies, such as the Alien, Naturalization, and Sedition Acts. Another thing that Jefferson did was to send Lewis and Clark out west to explore, beginning a long tradition of prominent Clarks. Anyways, Jefferson also attempted to avoid war with the British with the Embargo of 1807, which prohibited all Atlantic trade. The embargo backfired, however, and the U.S. economy tanked. The next president, James Madison, another Republican, ended the embargo permanently.
What happened next?
In a close vote, the country decided to go to war with Britain, which the Federalists had opposed. This war, the War of 1812, was really bad for the U.S., and the White House was burnt down during the fighting. Andrew Jackson won a battle at New Orleans, though, which established him as a war hero. By the end of the war, peace was achieved, but no border shifted and neither side had really gained anything. But that's not the way the voters saw it. Opposing the war basically ended the Federalist Party. Their legacy lived on through the Marshall Supreme Court, which asserted national dominance and upheld property rights.
Is there anything else I should know from this chapter?
You should probably know the Monroe Doctrine. That was the policy that the Americas were off limits for further colonization by European powers. Oh, and also the Adams-Onee Treaty bought Florida for the U.S. That's about it. Alright, finally, all done with chapters 5, 6, and 7. Now you should be all prepared for your test.
Whew. That's pretty cool.
Hey. Jimmy?